Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I think the speaker's working. Hello, I'm Rachel Wearmouth. I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the New Statesman, and welcome to this Labour Fringe event, which is hosted by IPPR and the Progressive Policy Institute, at which we're going to be assessing the challenges facing social democratic parties both in the UK, US and further afield, and try to take stock of some of the progress made in defining a new progressive consensus. So we're going to hear opening remarks from some of our speakers, and then we're going to move into a panel discussion, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions. We're going to be joined by David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, but he's on his way here, and it's going to be about another 10 minutes. I'm told that he walks quite slowly, so he's just making his way from another Fringe event at the moment, but he will be here. So our panel will be made up of David, Will Marshall, the President and Founder of the Progressive Policy Institute, Claire Ainsley, Director of the Centre-Left Renewal Project at the Progressive Policy Institute and former Director of Policy to some bloke called Keir Starmer, and Harry Quilter-Pinner, the Director of Research and Engagement at IPPR. Will, would you like to open with some remarks?
Sure, thank you very much, Rachel. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's just a great pleasure to be here in warm and sunny Liverpool. Maybe a little surprise. But we're at this conference of great expectations, so we're delighted to be here. And let me also thank IPPR for being really the host. We couldn't have secured this place, but we're really happy to partner with you, Harry, and your colleagues to talk about this challenge. So thanks for the opportunity. And then Claire Ainsley, I'll say a word more in a minute, and we are collaborators on a project that I want to talk about that's relevant. I also just want to say hello to the traveling party that's with me, Americans, representative congressional staff, House and Senate, and lieutenant governors and governors. Just raise your hand real quickly. Anyway, thank you for coming today as well. With that, let me plunge into our topic here. We've been following this renovation of labor under Keir Starmer for the last 3 years with keen interest, and I guess the first question is why, as somebody, an American from a center-left think tank in Washington, so interested in what happens in labor's ups and downs. The answer is that allowing for some significant differences in political culture and political structure, there are very strong parallels between what happens to labor and what happens to the Democrats. And sometimes new events show up first on this side, new trends and developments, and sometimes they show up on the other side. But sometimes they converge, and PPI was very instrumental in the last great era of progressive left conversation and dialogue, the center-left meetings in the late 90s and early 2000s. That really were launched by by labor and the Democrats, and that then spread all over the world and became an opportunity for comparing notes on political strategy, comparing ideas and learning from each other, and also cross-fertilization that I think buoyed everybody across the center-left spectrum. So we think that we are arriving at another moment of center-left ferment and success. Progressive parties are in power or governing in the U.S., in Germany, and Australia, where we were there earlier this year, Spain, Portugal, and of course, with labor poised, we hope, for victory next year. This is a really heartening development for us because we think that the fractured liberal democracies around the world, beset by a kind of a new and authoritarian populism, need a reinvigorated center-left to turn back this populist tide. A lot of parties haven't fared well in the face of it, but I think these two parties are sort of leading the way in doing that. And to reinforce these trends, we've begun a new project for center-left renewal that Claire Ainsley is heading up for us, and Claire has a great new report called Roadmap to Hope, which will come out later today or tomorrow, which takes a deep dive at the mutual challenges facing our parties and how we can how we can grapple with them. And so this is another great Anglo-American alliance. So it's great to be partnered with Claire. Now, amid all this optimism, of course, the populist threat hasn't receded around the world, and sadly, that's more true of America than any place else. We have a vengeful Donald Trump raging across the political landscape like Cocaine Bear. And so it's, this is a real and present danger. We can joke about it, but this man is a threat, a clear threat to democracy, not just, the democratic political fortunes. And so it's a fraught moment back home. Democrats are pretty anxious about a spate of recent polls that show President Biden trailing Donald Trump, or tied with or trailing Donald Trump. Strikes a lot of people as amazing. How could Biden be behind somebody that he's already beaten once, who's facing 91 felony counts, and whose business empire may be unraveling because a judge is trying to break it up. Now, polls aren't predictive for an election that's a year out, so we shouldn't panic, but it's still a pretty good question. Why are we as far behind the 8 ball now as we seem to be? The answer, I think, has 2 parts. First, as dangerous as Trump is, he's the consequence, not the cause of our problems in the United States. That is, the underlying problem is this kind of conservative or really a populist cultural rebellion that is aimed at both established parties, because remember, the old Republicans are gone. They've been taken over by the populists, and we're trying to keep them from returning to power. But even if Trump is, defeated again, that's not going to make the deep sense of social and economic dislocation that plagues working class voters just miraculously go away. And that takes us to the second part, and my last point, which is that, for all the good we've done in the last 3 years, and there's been a lot of good, we still haven't, on the Democratic side, made sufficient headway in cracking the toughest nut, which is working class voters. The Democrats have, seen the opening of a diploma divide. It now defines the new class structure of American politics. We win people with college degrees. Joe Biden won 61% of them last time. The Republicans win non-college white voters by overwhelming margins, which is why this election is even close. And more disturbingly for us right now is we're beginning to see erosion among the non-white working class, particularly black and Hispanic voters, who have moved pretty significantly toward the other party since 2012. So our huge challenge is to regain the allegiance of the working class. We think that is a moral imperative. It's also an electoral imperative, because these voters will represent almost 2/3 of the electorate next time. Happily, labor seems to be closer to that goal than the U.S. Democrats, and so we're encouraging Democrats to pay attention to what's going on here and all the tremendous progress that the party's made over the last 3 years. We're terrifically impressed by Keir Starmer and his team, and the very disciplined focus, on economic growth and enterprise and prosperity, because somehow the progressive parties have drifted away. We used to be the parties of growth and prosperity for average people, and we don't hold that portfolio in voters' minds anymore. It's a huge problem for us. And we, getting creative about public service delivery. We're very interested in what your plans are there, and the general centering of working class cultural and moral aspirations, as well as economic hopes, which is absolutely essential on our side. And I think we have even deeper cultural cleavages to try to span on the Democratic side. So we're very happy to be here today and to cheer on this great conference.
Thanks, Phil, for those opening remarks, if not altogether uplifting for us all. Harry, would you like to make some remarks now?
Yeah, of course. And thanks to PPI for supporting today's event. We're really appreciative of the partnership, and we hope it continues. So I think we need to take ourselves back to when Keir Starmer was elected leader. And he's said at various times that, in his words, I've got to do Kinnock and Blair's job in one term. by which he means, and he said, to A, transform the party, B, expose the government as failing, and C, set out a vision for what a Labour government would deliver. And I think as we sit here today, around a year out from an election, we can say quite clearly that the first two of those have gone, on his terms, very well. The party has definitely changed. He's had some help from the government, no doubt, on the second goal of exposing the Conservatives as unfit to govern. Liz Truss and Boris have certainly done some of his work for him, but he's also done a very good job at kind of hitting the right notes. But there is still a question about the third part of this, about the vision. So a poll recently found that over 70% of voters want change. They don't think the government is the right answer to the problems that they face. But less than a third of voters think that Labour yet have the right answer. So there's still a lot of work to do to set out what a Labour government would deliver and why it has the answers to the challenges we're facing. And so this is obviously partly a deliberate choice by Starmer and his team to not pin his colours to the mast too clearly, to not go too bold. Given what we know about the fears of a lot of the general public about the Labour brand and the Labour Party. I think it was once described as like carrying a priceless Ming vase across the highly polished floor trying to get Labour elected, and they're definitely very cautious about what to promise. So it's partly a deliberate choice at the moment to leave some ambiguity there. But there's also a deeper problem, which is that progressives, not just in the UK, but abroad, looking at Albanese, looking at Biden, looking at Schulz, are searching for what a social democratic answer to the world's problems are. There's a lack of what David Miliband described in a talk a year or two ago of a progressive, clear progressive project. And that's certainly visible, I think, in the Labour Party's current narrative, but it's not a distinctly UK problem. It's a shared problem across countries of how to fill in this project. So think, what is our equivalent today of the third way, or the politics of the New Deal? Do we have an equivalent story that's as ambitious and as compelling to voters as previous iterations of social democratic parties? So what we can see, though, is some themes starting to emerge, and I think looking abroad does help to start to fill in that gap. And I'm going to name, I think, 4 themes that you can start to see emerge, whether it's in Australia and Albanese, whether it's Biden in the US, which I think Biden has a claim to a project more than other progressive leaders. I think they're out ahead to some degree, although there are challenges, as Will was mentioning. There are 4 themes that I think we can pick out and we could start to build this project on. The first is leaning into a more active state to try and drive growth and decarbonisation, and you see that in the Labour Party's agenda. You see it definitely in Biden's agenda, and a real focus on shared growth to deal with economic insecurity. The second is a more pro-worker outlook than we've seen amongst social democrats for a while. You see that again mostly with Biden. But that's really about this agenda, and I'm hoping that Claire might pick up on this more, I don't know, the respect agenda of trying to ensure that everybody has dignity and respect in their work and leaning into greater regulation in the labour market to achieve that. Third, I think we see this theme of public infrastructure, of investing in things like the care system as a new frontier of politics. Albanese has put forward a very ambitious proposal on that. I think it got a bit lost in the trying to get Biden's deals through, but there's an exciting agenda there that I think progressives are building on. And finally, putting standards back into public life. I think exposing the fact that there's this really low trust in politics, and that the right, in its shift to the right to populism, has exacerbated that. And you saw that with Boris here, you're seeing it with Trump in the US. And I think there's a very clear agenda there that parties are trying to build on. We're starting to see those themes come out in Keir Starmer's agenda, the Green Prosperity Plan, the Gordon Brown review. But I think Labour now need to double down on those areas and build on them, both to win, to show that they've got an agenda, but also, more importantly, to govern. You can win without a project, but you cannot govern. You cannot transform a country without a really clear long-term project. And what we're seeing is really low trust, really low patience with politicians in terms of delivering. At the moment, we're seeing this huge swing back from the Conservatives to Labour, the red wall starting to swing back. That can swing, that is going in Labour's favour at the moment, but that is not, those voters will not be locked in. If they vote for the Labour Party at the next election, politics is so volatile, they will not be locked in. The thing that will lock those voters back in is a clear social democratic, bold project that can transform lives, and that's the challenge that a future Labour government needs to be able to answer.
Okay, thank you. Claire, and then I'll come to you, David.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. And thank you to IPPR for hosting us in this beautiful venue. I was just thinking it makes a big change from what I'd been doing this time last year, the previous conferences, a lot more glamorous, I have to say. So in terms of the questions that we were being asked as a team, when I was part of the team, what do we stand for now? Harry's right, like all those questions are being asked of the centre-left globally. We've obviously been through a dire period, particularly after the 2007-8 financial crisis, where the performance of social democratic parties, some have just almost completely imploded. Others have found it a very difficult path to find their way back. We're starting to see some of these sort of tentative signs of revival. So I give full credit to Starmer and the team for what they're doing here. But it is part of a trend where voters are becoming disaffected from the populist right in some places. In other places, the populist right are still very much a presence. And they're starting to look at our side again. And they're asking, well, what are you now? What do I get? What do you stand for? So all of the questions that get asked of the UK Labour Party are absolutely the same sorts of questions that are being asked at centre-left parties around the world. So I was delighted to work with PPI to look at some of what is being brought forward. I think it's exciting what's happening, but I think it's also really precarious. I think that there's inspiration that we can take. I think there's some genuine just election learning that we can take, the good, the bad and the ugly. I also think there are a lot of constraints that the international context puts on us, and they're not just fiscal, which is what we are rightly obsessed and concerned about with the UK, but there are a whole set of global changes, and David, I'm sure will talk to this, that make what Labour might do as a national government in one country very, very dependent on the global context. But I think we probably don't give enough time to. We've got an idea on what we think the project should be. So we're bringing out a report tomorrow about where voters are at now. And a lot of this is about people absolutely are, it, they want the Tories out in lots of ways. They are coming over to us much more slowly, particularly working class voters. And a lot of that is not particularly about the parties themselves. A lot of that is about people just feeling like that things don't work for them anymore, we looked through like hundreds and hundreds of responses from voters who were just saying, you just can't get on anymore. And this thing about just the same things, us and IPPR and others have been saying about work not being enough to pay for these rising costs. And some of it is about short-term costs, but a lot of it is just about the fact that you just can't get onto the housing ladder, they can't get their children on, all of those sorts of things. So people feeling like that deal has broken down, where if you work hard, you can get on. And economic security is at the core of it, and I think it's where Labour needs to start with their offer. But it's also about a deeper sense that people aren't playing by the rules anymore. And you saw how angry people were during COVID when there was the breakdown in the rules at number 10. But there's also just this sense that if you're doing the right thing, you're not getting the reward for it. And I think that is the project for social democratic parties. I think that is what we are about. What the answers to that are, I think Biden is onto a new kind of economic program, if you like, with this big infrastructure spend. But as I'm sure Will's written about and talked to, that isn't necessarily translating to voters. So I think there's a big question for us about the fact that and what can seem like quite an abstract theory actually really needs to make people feel as though their family finances are going to be better off as a result of this. So what can we learn from that? How do we translate this really big infrastructure spend? I think Labour have set out the bones of that approach. They've already brought out their missions for government, industrial strategy, devolution. So I think the Green Prosperity Plan, it has the ingredients. They're also bringing out quite a lot on housing and on law and order. So they are speaking to the right areas, but at the moment, obviously we want to see it put together in an election campaign. In terms of bold and radical and transformative, the language that we like best, like that doesn't mean coming up with hundreds of policies. Like the Aussies got hammered by the Liberals when they brought out, in their 2019 election, where they brought out a massive policy programme. They were much more disciplined going into 2022. Albanese led them into a government which has not stopped from being reforming, but he led them through a campaign that was much more streamlined. So bold doesn't have to mean volume, it means scale of ambition, and it has to be really, really targeted. So I think we should see it in that context. Schulz has, as Harry mentioned, led on respect. I think we need to learn from that it needs to translate into something that people can really understand, because I like it as a concept, but I think this notion that we need to remake the deal for working people is the core, and a core of that is wages, its costs, its housing, its educational opportunities, and a sense that people need to play by the rules. And finally, then, I think we've got some really big kind of constraints on us, and that isn't just the fiscal. The idea that we can, Labour can get into number 10 if we get there and fix everything, I think is just not realistic. We've got to think about globally, how do we reposition and reorientate this mission-driven government, find alliances and allegiances where we can in a world that feels, as uncertain and insecure this weekend as I think as it's ever done. We're also going to have to work with governments with which we disagree, and that is going to be incredibly challenging. So I think we should understand that these are the failures of the right, and it's an opening for us, but it's no more than that. And if we walk through that, if we take that chance, then it can be the centre-left's decade again. But it is no more than an opening, and it's on us to prove that we can be the party that answers their concerns.
Thank you. David, I don't know if you want to offer some opening remarks and maybe touch on the events in Israel and Gaza this weekend.
Well, look, let me just say that, and thank you very much for inviting me. My attitude to this subject is governed by voting for the first time in 1992. Now, in those days, I looked like Michael Jackson. I fully expected Neil Kinnock to win. That was the expectation. And you know the result. We lost. It's also conditioned by history. And history tells us that since 1900, 123 years, 3 Labour prime ministers that have actually got a majority from the British people, Attlee, Wilson, Blair, Callaghan and Brown, also as prime ministers, but not managing to convince the electorate to vote for them. And we have had so many Conservative prime ministers, and a lot recently, that clearly our opponents are the natural default of the British people by virtue of their electoral success. So I'm on the more cautious end when people speculate as to what will happen at the next general election. I think the other component that's really important, it has a bearing on what the offer should be for progressive parties, is that without a doubt, the one theme that flows through Western economies particularly is volatility in the electorate. That Boris Johnson could have won an 80-seat majority just a few years ago, and we could be seriously suggesting that the Labour Party, having been reduced to the worst record since 1935, could be on course to form the next government is extraordinary. And it mirrors what's gone on in other economies. The truth is that the issues that determined the win for Albanese and Biden had not been determined even 6 months before their elections, and that issue was COVID. that the SPD in Germany was trailing in the polls third, actually, for 46 weeks before the election. Then they moved into second 2 weeks before the election. Then they moved into first. And by the way, having just knocked on doors in Rotherglen, it was clear to me that when I was up there 2 weeks ago, there was still quite a lot of don't knows on the doorstep. They then all split for Labour in the last few days. So there's volatility in the electorate, and we have to fashion that and think about that, because some of the underpinning of that is obviously part of the strategy from those on the, and I don't think it's centre-right here, and I say that as a politician who in the past was a Labour politician who most people would have said can work across the political divide. David Cameron asked me to lead a review into the criminal justice system just 6 years ago. Could you imagine Liz Truss or Boris Johnson ringing me up and saying, David, can you help us on the criminal justice system? So clearly our political opponents have moved into a populist, rightward place. And there was a lot of focus on the Labour Party and the Corbyn years. Perhaps now people are focusing on what in fact has happened to what was traditionally a one-nation party. Doesn't feel like one nation at the moment. Lots of discussion of woke, particularly creating division in the electorate. So one of the ingredients is, how do we conceive of a programme that really feels like nation building? All of the nation together, I think, is central. And two, how do you develop a political language that does not overpromise? I just don't think the electorate, and it goes back to the points that Claire made, you cannot go to the electorate, I don't think progressive parties can go to the electorate with a sort of manifesto that looks like a telephone book of policies. They do not believe that you were genuinely going to deliver that long list. And that was what happened to us at the last election. It's what happened to Australian Labour in the past. One of the ingredients is that the offer that progressive parties are taking to the electorate to win are genuinely things that they believe you can see through. It doesn't mean the scale of your ambition is lost, but it means the articulation of your policies is clear. That does mean, and I say this with all due respect to IPPR, I've been working with IPPR for all of my 24 years in politics, but what Labour can't do is just take policies from wonderful progressive think tanks, offer them to the electorate without thinking pretty hard about how you communicate that policy. So absolutely, the central proposition of any progressive party at the moment is industrial policy. It is the secure economics that Rachel Reeves is setting out. It's what you've seen in the United States with the Biden administration and the that is the central proposition built on that race for clean, green technology, and our green prosperity plan is at the center of our economic program. But that has to translate to jobs. It has to translate into a language that people understand. It can't feel remote and distant from people's ordinary lives in the towns, villages, and cities that make up this country. And that is still a work in progress for all progressive parties. So there is something about how we communicate, how we get that scale of ambition in terms of the new economy and people accessing the jobs. We have just made an announcement today that's basically an announcement about skills. Even the language of skills can feel a bit remote. So when I do town hall meetings, I say, bring back night schools. And everyone cheers because they understand that that is adult learning. They've heard a politician talk about not just this thing called skills that might be for young people, but actually me. And what does it mean? When you say night schools, what does that translate as? It translates as a policy idea that is about understanding that you really can't give up your job in a low-skill part of the economy or a job that's about to be replaced by AI to go to university for 3 years, to pay $9,000 a year, to put your family on hold to get that better job. You need a government that's responsive to where you are in your life, to meet you with your skills need, to support you to skill up, to access that new job. It's an old idea that has to be refashioned in a new way. And right across that industrial economy, we've got to develop a language that really meets people where they are today. I do think, though, that the key underpinning of it was how we do it together. We must not be seduced into the sort of tangential arguments that are the arguments of division around the woke issue, that, of course, I'm not suggesting aren't important, but in the end are not about where most people are in their everyday lives. And it's really important to go back to the 5 missions. If you look at those missions as we've set out, whether it's having the fastest growing growth in the G7 over the next decade or so, that race for a clear green economy, the opportunity we're offering for all people, and the skills announcement today is part of that. 3 of those missions are in the effect about political economy. That is the vision, that is the offer. Believe me, it's as exciting as anything we've offered before. It hasn't quite landed with the kind of razzmatazz that you would associate with the Clinton, Obama, Blair era of politics. I'm not sure, by the way, people are going to be seduced by that kind of, because they're just not in that place as an electorate. They want it, they've seen that, and they're not going to be entirely convinced, I think, we've seen also across the world. So that's the challenge for the progressive. It's both the communication, stay on the economy, articulate what you're talking about, make it real for people, don't make the offer too wide, and certainly don't give the impression that this, you've got to demonstrate where the money is coming from to deliver that very ambitious agenda.
Thank you. Okay, I think a good place to start actually is to think about last week's Conservative Party conference, and you saw elements of the governing party that are quite populist, Suella Braverman in particular, talking about a hurricane of migrants. I wonder how the Labour Party, and in particular Keir Starmer as an individual politician, can combat that when voters are in that kind of place, when they're in that, they're feeling quite cynical. And Will, I'm quite interested in your observations on this, considering that Joe Biden had to take on the world's biggest populist in President Trump.
Yeah, well, I defer to the others on the panel on the Labour choice, but on our side, Biden has passed. Harry, you mentioned a big infrastructure, big public investment offer. Well, that's Joe Biden, $4 trillion. Infrastructure of all kinds, broadband, and 2 other big bills for the green transition and for semiconductors. So we're spending a lot of money, we're deploying a lot of money to try to associate, to try to rev up the economy, but also to make it clear to folks that that's fundamental. But you can't ignore the power of crime and immigration in the United States. These are really important issues. The voters define the key issues. Us and think tanks don't do it. And they keep telling us, this is important to us. And if you have nothing to say, if you cede the issue to the other side, well, silence is death. They impute to you the worst possible positions that our opponents try to lay on us. So, and so Biden did not endorse defunding the police, which is a pretty dumb overreaction to events in 2020. But we still aren't out of the woods as a party because Democrats control the big cities. The big cities are where crime is rising. We have to have better answers than we have. And the same goes for immigration. So I just think you can't separate the prosperity and order and stability are intertwined in a way now. And you know where I heard this was Keir Starmer in May at a Progressive Britain conference that we also were engaged in, and he made that connection absolutely explicit and clear, and I think he's absolutely dead right.
Claire, I don't know whether you want to tell us how you think Keir Starmer might combat populism.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like Braverman's comments are repulsive, and her strategy is repulsive. Like, we know what she's trying to do in terms of using that kind of language, and it's the opposite of what David talked about in terms of nation building. In terms of what Labour and the centre-left does, I think part of this is about this notion of security, and it not just being about financial security, although that's part of it. It's also about not just dealing with issues of, well, we've got to have a line on immigration or a line or a plan on crime. What Labour, I think, is trying to get at, and I think what Keir got at in his comments about security, is people need to feel a sense of security and order and safety in order to feel, I hope, more compassionate, more generous, more prosperous, etc. So I think Labour having clear plans and getting people need that kind of financial and economic security, but they also need personal safety in terms of, we've mentioned it around crime, but we also need to understand people's kind of psychological safety, if you like. And therefore, I think Keir was right to be so clear about wanting to restore order to the national borders. Like, he gets that that is a problem, and that is not something that we can afford to be complacent about. The idea of that being people's image of immigration is not going to make them feel more compassionate or generous. So I think get the sort of psychological safety that people are feeling right on crime and on immigration and on their finances. And then I think we have an opportunity to start to make people feel more optimistic about the future and the hope and getting Britain's future back. But I don't think we can do that unless we sufficiently address those former points.
Harry, do you think there are lessons that Keir can learn on combating populism from leaders across the world?
I think the jury's still out. I think clearly people are taking a second look at social democratic parties across the world. And I think all of those parties are trying to answer fundamentally the same set of questions, which is there's two big challenges, I think. There are voters who basically feel anger, and that is leading to kind of votes for the far right or for conservative parties that are aping the far right. And there's apathy, which is not turning out. Politics doesn't have the answers. And those two groups of voters, and sometimes they move between, are the big challenge that progressive parties are trying to address. And I think I've heard all the kind of challenges from Will and others with where the Biden administration's at. I still think it's the closest we have at the moment to something that's commensurate to the scale of the problem that people face in their lives. It might fail, but I don't see a different option on the table. And what really worries me is if we don't try something, I agree with everything that David and others have said about the language around this needing to connect to real people. There's certainly a need for, in the UK context, for things to feel, the last thing you want to do is label your policy as bold or radical. The voters do not like that. Do not say that. But having said that, the scale of the problems we face are massive, and therefore the solutions are going to have to be quite bold, even if we don't say that to voters. And I think what worries me is you can see it. Macron and France is what really scares me, right? So Macron has not gone down this route of more active state, a big industrial policy. And I really genuinely worry that next time they'll go Le Pen, because it's, for all of the strengths of the Macron government, I think they've not yet dealt with some of the underlying causes, which are definitely cultural and economic, and the overlap. And so I think if I was Keir Starmer, if I was David and others, I would be looking at all of those progressives, but I would be trying to look at Biden and go, well, what can we learn there, both in terms of the ambition, but also in terms of the delivery and making sure that it actually does deliver on that promise?
David.
Well, look, I mean, I think that the politics of Suella Braverman speak for themselves. And, you know, so much has been said, but I have to say, I thought the sight of a photo of her standing on a dog's tail said it all for me, really. I think it was absolutely right that Keir went to The Hague with Yvette Cooper, talking about the problem of criminal gangs, talking about the problem of working with our European partners, talking about how you get better security out with the border, but you can only do that with European colleagues. Then he is in France with me, with Macron, not laying all the problems at the door of the French, actually, but actually you can't solve these problems by describing Emmanuel Macron as an enemy. You've got to be able to work with our European partners, be honest with the general public that on leaving the European Union, we left the Dublin Agreement. That has repercussions for our ability to send people back to their country of origin. We left some of the mechanisms around security that allow us to understand and work effectively with our European partners, and to recognise that actually, and people know this, the climate emergency is driving migration. Actually, countries like Turkey, Greece are at the frontier of that challenge, but we can work with our European partners to make sure that the system is fair, and the starting point for doing that is certainly not having a system where the processing takes several years. And I think that has really cut home that you get a lot of this rhetoric from Suella Braverman on the subject, but actually nothing practical, nothing is real, never mind the amount of money, never mind the morality and the ethics of suggesting that the best place to send people or to sort people or processing out is actually to send people to Rwanda. So that's us absolutely not running away from an issue that the electorate do care about, but being really, really sound and sensible about how we would go about with dealing with that problem, recognising that the mainstay of the issues in Britain are to do with the economy and the state of public services. That's where the electorate are. That's what the people of Rotherglen were voting about this week. And they were holding the SNP up against their record. The independence issues have sort of fallen away and receded. The issues around the economy and public services have come into light. They look at the SNP's record. They look at what Labour's proposing and they say, actually, do you know, I'm going to go with these guys because they're where we are, and what they're saying is tangible, the offer is real, and actually this stuff around independence is not actually going to affect my day-to-day experience.
You mentioned the economy there, so I think it's good for us to move on to that right now. So Rachel Reeves has talked an awful lot about Bidenomics and how she'd like a similar plan to that here. Do you think that British people really understand what Bidenomics even is? And do you think that they accept it or are cynical about the idea of reindustrialisation and buy, make and sell more in Britain? Claire?
So I'm not sure. Well, Will can answer, do people understand what Bidenomics is? But I've read your article, so I know that I think that you think people are a bit sceptical. I mean, I think the infrastructure push is the right thing to do. So I think Harry is right. This is the exciting bit, I think, which is that it is in real time redefining what the state can do. And it is not about we're going to own everything, run everything. It's more about how we crowd in private sector investment. So at the core, I don't want to call it Bidenomics because I hate the phraseology, but I think the core of it, which is that these days you can have an active, modern government that is basically providing almost this catalysing role, I think is right. I absolutely think it is not translating to the US electorate, let alone whether it would here. So I think on that point of electoral strategy and how you communicate, that is really important. In terms of the policy, I do think we have to be clear about what our approach to trade is as Labour. Like, we need to have a real alternative to global Britain. And I'm afraid it cannot just be, we'll do deals with the people that we want to do deals with and we like. It has to be, how are we going to make ourselves competitive, open? How are we going to win the race? Like, Rachel is completely on the case in terms of setting out how we're going to win the race on technology, on the industries of the future, but I think we can't, whilst I'd love to see more buy, made and sold in Britain, but I also think we have to be realistic that in order to compete in a global economy, we need to be open on trade, we need to be pro-innovation. So I think there are bits of what Biden's doing which we absolutely should be looking to. I think there is a UK Labour version that we're adopting, which I think learns some of the lessons from it.
Can I just come in there very quickly? If you look at the revolutions of, let's take 150 years, the Industrial Revolution, we in this country were at the centre of it. The Fordist Revolution after the Second World War, the birth of cars, automation, America was at the centre of it, but we were alongside them. The computer and internet age, we were part of that revolution. The question is, are we going to be tangential to the green transition or part of it? It's very simple. Rishi Sunak made his decision a few weeks ago. And by the way, Scott Morrison tried the same politics as Rishi Sunak in Australia. It fell flat with the Australian public. They could see what was happening. They wanted to be part of the transition and the revolution. It's hugely important people understand the issues as long as politicians speak, about the jobs and the economy, that they understand that are the engines of growth and success. And I do believe, in a sense, this is summed up in one sentence. There are two visions of the great country in which we live, and it is a great country. There's a small Tory little England, and there's a Great Britain that's international and outward looking. We've got to be part of that second revolution.
Harry.
I think do voters understand? I mean, in the US, Will, you can speak to that, but my guess would be no, they don't, and they're not going to hear either. I don't think voters particularly want to or have the time to engage in economic models or the kind of technocratic detail of policy. That's not what we need to be talking to voters about. But they absolutely do understand if things are getting better or worse, if industry is leaving their towns and cities or coming in. And I think that's the nub of this is, for too long, I think progressives and the centre-right have been too kind of laissez-faire about economics and industry, and as a result, we've seen industries leave the UK and leave communities, particularly outside of London. And what this new agenda is trying to do is correct that, is to drive the industries of the future, as David's talking about, and to make sure that they are genuinely shared across the country. And I think if we can do that, the thing that will sell it is the change in the feel, in the social fabric of so many of the communities across the UK, of the jobs that people are doing, whether they pay enough to live decently. And I guess the thing I would say on Bidenomics is, I think we need to be a bit patient, and I know that's hard because there's a US election in a year, but these things do not happen in 2-3 years. It takes decades, so we need, if Labour is going to do this, it needs some quick wins that start to show a direction of travel, and then it needs fundamentally, it needs more than one election win in order to lock in some of the gains, and I'd say the same is true of Bidenomics. I would say the worst thing, I'm not a US commentator, but the worst thing that the US could do is throw the baby out with the bathwater at this point. That's going to take a long time to lock in the gains of Bidenomics, and so I think patience is probably needed.
Okay, well.
Well, I would just want to separate Bidenomics from the constituent elements, of the things he's done. He's done some great things. The infrastructure, long overdue. Trump couldn't get it done, Biden and the Democrats got it done. The big IRA, that's a big clean energy transition. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. It has almost nothing to do with inflation reduction, but it is giving a big goose to the clean energy transition. And as Claire says, it's crowding in private investment. It's not that, I'm for more state investment, but it is the interaction effect with private investment that's really striking here. And we're seeing all these chip-making plants and private money flowing in to the United States to put in new chip fabs because the president has decided that we're not going to get behind in this critical technology. So industrial policy as a strategy for as you say, David, inventing the next economy. Yes, by all means, look at it, study it, that's good. But Bidenomics, has become, people don't believe, if you put the question, the individual elements poll a lot better than Bidenomics does, and that's because Biden is not popular with a bunch of the electorate, about half of it, the Trump voting half. But I hate to say it, but even on the other side, and this is particularly true of working class voters, who are the key target here, they don't believe their economic lives have improved much under Biden, which I would say is objectively not true, but they don't believe it. But, the reason they don't believe it is that the cost of living is high. It's in their face every day. So when they go out to buy gas and groceries, or try to get housing, and loans, the interest rates going up to fight inflation has affected their ability to get, money. So the felt experience of the voters is that those long-term investments haven't paid off in a way that are tangibly evident in my life right now. So you just have to be, yes, the underlying policies are strong, but you've also got to communicate to the people on their terms, what you're doing to get the price of everyday, all the stuff that's eating into their purchasing power. What are you going to do about that? It seems to me that the White House has made a tactical error probably in talking about Bidenomics and making it personal, putting the president's name on it. They got good policies, but they don't line up with what people want to see happen. Their number one demand on the economy, which is get inflation under control.
I'll move to questions in a second, but I just want to ask the entire panel, given this fringes on internationalism. So what one lesson could Keir Starmer learn from a centre-left party leader before the next election that would be really valuable to him? Claire?
I think the one thing he can learn, and I think he's learned it, but I think the one thing he can learn, and I think we need to hear, is what we've touched on, which is this policy, politics, and the communication of it. Be streamlined in what you communicate, because we've got 3 days where we get to go on the broadcast media. That doesn't happen the other 362 days of the year. So we've all got to go out there with the same clear message and streamlined programme. So learn from what the Aussies did well and what they got wrong to get there. Be streamlined in what you offer. So there is no Ming vase. Be bold in it, but be really clear and get us all out there for the next year advocating for it.
I think I would say, kind of speaking to what Claire just said, talk caution, but deliver big. I think progressives have a tendency to overinflate how radical they're being, and that really doesn't go down well. So I think be very cautious in communication. Clear, speak to people's views, but we don't oversell it. But then don't buy into that rhetoric in government because I think the scale of the problems that we're facing are too big to be fixed with small tweaks to the system.
David?
Well, look, I think that this point around how you approach the electorate is something that we learn from across the world. You can't go in with a sort of yellow phone book of manifesto pledges that feel uncosted. They're not going to buy it. It's got to be where people are in their ordinary lives. And I think that the lessons now from progressives who have win, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Norway, or whether it's in the United States, are those same lessons, basically. And I think that we have, the great thing is that we have, learnt them. And this Claire makes this very important point. Our political opponents have a lot more money than we do, full stop. They also have very powerful friends in parts of the media growing. In an election, the rules are suddenly fair because there are election rules that mean that we can get your message out. It's one of the reasons why I suspect we have to be more streamlined in the way that we approach the electorate so that they can really understand those messages. Because out with the general election cycle, there's a lot of money. And by the way, Rishi Sunak has raised the cap on election spending. I wonder why. And they are still per quarter raising more money than the the Labour Party. So for all of those reasons, make your policies clear, make them relevant to the electorate, and be absolutely clear that the centre of that is economic.
Okay, I'm going to move to questions now because I'm aware there's a lot of people here. So should we take 3 at once? This lady here, there's the guy in the second row and front row here. Hi.
Thanks. Andrea Westall, I was at IPPR in 97, so I've been through this particular point. But I want to go back to that because the problem was at the time we were, excuse me, really picking up a lot of really interesting policy stuff from around the world. Unfortunately, and I'm going to slightly push back on the UK-US link, that became so strong that it actually crowded out a lot of really interesting stuff. And arguably, I would say some of it led to what Henry was talking about, which is where a lot of things got unmoored. So the economy wasn't really working for places. And I think we missed out there. So I was on a commission recently for the S&D group in the European Parliament at the time at which we left Europe, ironically. But there's so much interesting stuff going on there about reinventing social democracy, about future-proofing, about rethinking the welfare state, the new risks, new security, that I think it will be a shame not to keep that open. It's not just about the election now, it's all of these things that are coming up and making this relevant. So I just plea that we go a bit wider.
A bit wider. Yeah.
Hi, Joseph Kellan, delegate for the Society of Labour Lawyers. When we're talking about internationalism, and particularly in the United States, one of the biggest fears that I potentially have is looking towards what's been going on recently with the green transition and the recent strikes which have been occurring in Detroit, which many conservative commentators have argued relate to a shift towards battery manufacturing, which requires fewer people to be involved in those manufacturing jobs. The question that I have to the panel is, how do you foresee keeping working class voters on board whilst also shifting to industries which may well not employ the same number of people in the future?
Thank you. And the front row here.
Hi, my name is Luke Murphy. I currently work at IPPR and lead our energy work. Quite interested in what the panel has said about the degree to which the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act and potentially in future the Green Prosperity Plan filtering through to voters. I was interested in the point that Adam Tooze made recently about the fact that actually one of the reasons why voters might not be feeling it in the US is because actually manufacturing only makes up around 12% of GDP, and that's not dissimilar in the UK. And while I think it's the right strategy economically, is it enough? And I think one of the things that didn't get through the Build Back Better that was kind of negotiated out was massive investment in the social infrastructure, like Harry mentioned, around childcare and also like wider services. So, you know, the question is it as a complete agenda as it needs to be, and is it not the case that it's not feeding through because the vast majority of people in America are not employed in the industry where the IRA is focused?
Okay, so there was a plea to go a little bit wider in taking in influences than just the transatlantic relationship. And the, I don't know, which we'll go into that first, do you think? David?
Well, it struck me, just going back to the point made by our colleague from IPPR back in 1997, that, and some people, you know, reflected on me, were we further along at that point than we are now? But of course, the point was we've been 18 years in opposition, and I don't want to wait 18 years for us to be further along on that journey. But the broader point that the ideas do not just come from the US, I think is well made. You know, and it is important, and I sensed this when I was in Montreal with Keir a few weeks ago, that it's a conversation that's not just a transatlantic conversation, it's a European conversation as well. I think that your account of the political economy, I do think is centred around the Green Prosperity Plan and the jobs that flow from that. It's not just batteries, but clearly We have to be in the conversation on supply chains, rare earths, and the minerals necessary. It's wider than just that, though. You have to be clear on the economies of the future. Biotech, for example, is an example of that. You also, I think, have to have an account of what a lot of the public are hearing about AI and the way in which that will mean. I mean, there will always be jobs. People give the impression that AI will take all jobs. It will not take care jobs. It will not take construction jobs. AI will not build your house for you or paint the walls. There's a whole raft of jobs that it's not going to take. But clearly there are parts of the economy that will lose out as a result. So you've got to give that broad account. But I do think that in the end, when progressives win, they tend to own the future. And that boils down to a couple of things that the public can see and understand. You don't have to overcomplicate it and have a prescription for absolutely everything.
Okay, David took in all three there, helpfully. Harry, so plea for the Labour Party to look beyond the US and green trend. Sorry. Green transition. You know, we might have fewer but better quality jobs, and how do you communicate with voters about that? And is Bidenomics broad enough as a project? I don't know.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to come in on the various points, please do.
To Andrea, yeah, I totally agree, and we are looking at Europe as well. Karis and I are hopefully planning a trip to Berlin soon to learn from Schulz. Definitely. I wanted to pick up in more detail on the second 2 points. On Joseph, your point about strikes and Detroit and the job creation, I think all of the evidence suggests that if parties get the industrial strategy policies right, and that's not a given, that's a really hard thing to do. There's a reason why industrial policy for a long time had a bad name. It's because it didn't always work. Like there's a real task to recreate it in a way that delivers. But the evidence suggests it should in total create more jobs than it loses. The green transition, for example. The challenge is the transition. It's the fact that those jobs don't necessarily match. And that's where I think we have to look at skills policy and welfare policy as seriously as we're thinking about economic policy. And the two need to integrate. And this is where I do get a little bit nervous and I understand why we've gone down, why people like the Labour Party have gone down this route, which is unless there's investment not just in the kind of capital side of the books, as in the job creation, the industry creation, but also in the revenue side, as in skills budgets, welfare budgets, and reforming those things, that transition won't work. And at the moment, those services are on their knees, and so there is going to be a challenge, and I'm delighted to hear the skills announcement today for that reason. And then just Luke, your point briefly, I think is right. At the start of the period under Keir, Rachel was talking a lot about the everyday economy, she still does, but I think that's probably got a little bit less prominent in the story. And if you're looking at what's going to create jobs across the whole country, it is going to be healthcare, it's going to be social care, it's going to be childcare. And so there's a lot of work, I think, to do to set out what Rachel calls the industrial strategy for those things as well. And we probably, as IPPR, need to champion that a bit more than we are at the moment.
Claire?
Yes, on the point about Europe, yes, the PPI's project is definitely not just a US-UK transatlantic dialogue, and a couple of weeks ago I was in Rome having a very similar conversation with colleagues from around Europe who, funnily enough, made the point that this time around they said, we really need to be connecting up with outside of Europe as well. Much of because the economy and kind of global trade has changed so much. In a sense, kind of their argument was that and we've seen this in a lot of the data that we've seen, that a lot of the problems that we're talking about in terms of people feeling less optimistic about the future, it is an affliction of some of our slower growing economies. So the UK is particularly bad. But if you contrast our trust in government with, say, Singapore, for example, it's very, very different. So this is not just the US, UK, but it is a European problem as well. But we need to be looking outside for those remedies. So for sure, I think in terms of that sort of wider point, which is where do ideas come from, I think part of what is exciting is about where this is being done in practice as well, and I think that's what's partly is inspiring us about the US administration, but it's also partly why I feel inspired in Liverpool, because it's partly what Steve Rotherham, it's partly what Andy's doing, sometimes it's about the other mayors. So I think there's something that we need to do, and this is also about how we communicate, which is not about ideas being sort of handed to us from on high, and we can say this because we're at the IPPR and PPI, who are think tanks in that mould, but it's how can we do this together in practice, because politicians all over the world from the centre-left are having to do it. And that is my point about the kind of the green transition, is the question is, how do we keep working class voters on board? Well, I'd like to think about the question of, how do you make the green transition relevant to them? So rather than we have a thing that we've got to persuade other people about, how do we just stand in people's shoes and make sure that the solutions we come up with are not things that just are so jarring in their lives? Because actually, if we did what Python is doing in terms of the green transition and made our EVs cheaper by investing in the infrastructure in order to create market solutions, then I don't think we would have to necessarily have green policies which end up taxing people for the choices that they're not able to make. So I think we actually can take that inspiration of where we can find market solutions, where he's helping to create that innovative market. And that is about understanding the way people live their lives and they think. And, the voters aren't this sort of some remote thing that we have to communicate with it right at the end of the process. They are living the lives and are speaking the language that we need to use in politics in order to make ourselves relevant to them rather than the other way around.
Just to say one thing, there's a reason we set up IPR North in Manchester and Newcastle. There's a reason why Luke did citizens' juries across the whole of the country on environmental transition. It's because policies from on high from think tanks in Westminster don't work, and we do need to do that work to understand what the real problems are and how to communicate them.
Well, I want to pick up on the second two questions because they're related. The first was about the reaction of auto workers, unionized auto workers, to the green transition, and you're quite right that they're nervous. This isn't going to be as labor and intensive an industry if it goes green and if we go to electric cars. They know that, and that was, I think, it partly informed the strike. But it goes to the broader problem, which Claire just alluded to, of the clean energy transition in the working class. I'm just going to talk about the United States here, but we have a serious challenge in convincing people that this transition won't happen on their backs, and working people think it's already meant higher energy costs and maybe less reliable energy supplies. So in a very abstract way, you get everybody's for the clean energy transition. We understand we're going there and we want to get there, but working people are really worried that they're going to bear the disproportionate brunt of the pain of this transition. We haven't convinced them yet that that's not the case. So we're all excited about electric cars, but they're not. If you look at the numbers, 2% maybe have electric cars. They don't have plans to buy them. And so we have to handle this conversation in a way that brings them along and just doesn't assume that they are as swept up as enthusiasm in this transition as, say, our good friends on the progressive left. Secondly, your question and your point is exactly right. One of the problems in a way with Bidenomics as it's framed is that it speaks to a surpassingly small part of the American workforce, which is people work in factories. That is not even the majority of the working class, not even close to being a majority. It's a shrinking number. It has been shrinking for 3 decades, and it will probably continue to shrink. So the working class in America is maybe 1/3 factory and construction workers, the blue-collar workers, sort of your classic stereotype, but the real working class is healthcare workers, it's, people working in the service and care economy, and so nothing about pumping money into an industrial revival really speaks to their immediate interest, and I think that's one of the reasons that Bidenomics is as a term, as a concept, struggling.
Three more questions, please. 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. One of the points that has been made in passing by Will, that I think is a key lesson from abroad that ought to be sort of made more explicit. It's about the macroeconomic environment in the short term. You were saying earlier, Will, that you thought that objectively the working class should be better off under Biden, but they don't believe it because the cost of living is high. And it's one thing progressives giving themselves a big agenda for a long-term plan, a vision that's going to pay dividends in the long term, but if we go into an election without saying something that is about the cost of living that is weighing people on people's minds, it might all be for nothing, as Biden may himself experience next year.
So sorry, what was the question?
The question is, but the point is, I'm trying to make another key lesson from abroad, from progressives abroad, is that they need to be talking more about the cost of living, and it's not all about grand plans and about the green transition over the next decade. It's also about people who are worried about the cost of living now, and that is a key lesson from abroad as well.
Okay. Lady with the dog. Very lovely dog.
It's like the lady with the fan. Okay, so my name's Dame Sally Powell. I'm ex-councillor, ex-NEC, and I'm an expert tax lawyer. So, following up what David said, if you all remember PFI, the public didn't understand it. What the public understood was a new hospital for my son and a new school for my daughter. That's what they understand, not PFI. And I remember going on Radio 4 and saying that, and actually John Prescott congratulated me. First time ever, but there we go.
Not the last, though.
No. People are not worried about necessarily the cost of living. They're worried about money. They're worried about the cost of things. So why don't we do what the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham did and introduce free social care? It's the only borough, I think Newham have just adopted it. It's actually cheaper than putting people into residential care homes. And I know, because my husband, who was a Member of Parliament, had 10 strokes. He was the leader of the council who introduced this policy. He is now the major beneficiary. He now has 24-hour care in his own home, which costs £55,000 a year. That is actually cheaper than care homes. People are worried about the cost of care, where they're going to get the money. Moving on, I stood in the rain with my poor dog.
Sorry, I don't mean to hurry you along, but we don't have too much long left.
Okay, I did my own focus group in the by-election. And the outcome of it is Keir is not so popular up there.
Is this in Scotland, sorry?
Yeah,
Yeah.
And we need Scotland. And the last thing, which is my question, is why are we not reforming IHT, inheritance tax? Because it's only the working class and the middle class who pay it, because the rich get round it.
So social care and inheritance tax. Right, okay. And this gentleman at the back there.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to invite some comments on one particular country which we haven't mentioned, which I think we do need to learn lessons from, where there's been an incredible progressive wave, and that is New Zealand, with the incredibly popular Jacinda Ardern, who fell foul of the toxicity of the culture war that was still happening in New Zealand. And of course, this week is the elections, where of course we've got Chris Hipkins, who's now the new leader of the Labour Party, reorientating the focus of the party on economic concerns. But it's still the National Party, the Conservative Party in New Zealand, that is still propelling and using identity politics and the culture war to foment and solidify support for them in that election. So to talk about economic concerns is absolutely crucial. Yes, I get that. But I don't feel as if we can leave the arguments around the culture war and identity politics. So what do we say? How do we challenge that rather than just leaving that as an issue for the Conservatives to garner and consolidate their support in the election?
Okay, thank you. So, should Starmer be talking more about the cost of living, essentially, was the question. Social care and inheritance tax, and to what extent should the Labour Party here engage in culture wars? I guess that's what you were, what you're asking. Who would like to go? We've only got about 10 minutes or so left. So, David.
No, bring Claire in. We haven't had a female one.
He's thinking.
I'm being generous.
So on cost of living, I think that's right. And I think part of what we're arguing is this point about like this remaking the deal, that like if you work hard, you get on. Like costs are completely the other part of the equation. So a lot of what people are saying is not just about wages not going up, is the fact that they then can't get decent housing, or they can't get, you know, the kids can't get onto the, we're talking about kids, we're talking about, you know, adults here, can't get onto the housing ladder. Like, that is a fundamental problem. And actually, childcare is important, but also so is it important that families can make a choice about how much they work when their kids are young. And that is really, really hard to do. And we probably don't talk about it as much as we should on the left of centre, but actually if the costs of housing and the other costs were a bit better, if work was a bit more flexible, then it would just free people up to make some of those choices. But frankly, it is very difficult for, not just because of the cost of childcare, but it's very, very difficult to afford to have a mortgage unless and raise your kids unless two of you are working full time, and even then there ain't much headroom. So people are saying that is not fair. So I think it's really important that we have like this thing about sort of reform is like, I agree. I think these are fundamentally, it's about hardwiring the economy so that it works in the interest of working people. And if we leave it to the market, it will not happen by accident. It has to happen by design. So I think as well as plans on raising wages, and there's lots of ways we should do that, stronger collective bargaining, you can raise the minimum wage, rewarding work over wealth, and so on. We also have to tackle the security of supply of our essential costs. Like, I have not got a problem about a market letting loose on, you know, on some of the things that I might buy. I have a big problem on market shocks to things like energy, food, essential items like that. So I think we could have a whole strategy which is about tackling and bringing down those costs. Because actually, if you take care, we have to look at where the cost base in care is and where the profit is. And how could you have, Hammersmith and Fulham are introducing systems where you can actually have more of the kind of co-op style model of how you bring down the cost. So actually, our headspace has got to get out of only thinking about how do we make state money flood into where we've got costs, and how do we bring down the cost base in the first place. And so the gentleman mentioned about identity and culture issues, I completely agree. I mean, part of our pitch is, and actually Will made the point, and I was talking about psychological safety, is you have to address the cultural issues. I think David's point about how you have a nation where people are included, where they belong, like people just feel just out of sorts, they just feel dislocated, they don't feel part of something. And I think that we have the ability to really inspire people by telling our own story on culture. I absolutely think the economy is a core part of that, but I think people's identity, feeling part of their place, which is why I'm so keen on the story that the Metro mayors tell about their places, and why councillors tell exciting stories, is how can Liverpool is already great, so we don't have to make Liverpool great again, but there is something about the pride in your place, which I think Labour is just brilliantly poised out of local government, out of community groups, out of the trade unions, and out of our brilliant Metro mayors to tell an authentic story, and I really hope we see that coming forward this week.
Will, how far do you think Keir Starmer should go in engaging with culture wars?
I don't want to presume to offer any advice to Keir Starmer, but I'll just talk about our context, and I agree with the premise of the question. I've already said that. But let me make 2 points, if I could. One was, David's made the point several times now that, you know, sometimes the electorate wants ambition. And I think in the 90s they wanted ambition, big ideas, you know, the neon of big ideas. But sometimes they want reassurance. And my feeling is that in the United States and perhaps here, that's really important to voters. They're tired of the incumbents, but, you know, they want to be reassured that the other party is ready to govern. So You know, we have what I call the fallacy of delivery, and Democrats can't understand some of our left-wing friends. You know, what Biden spent a ton of money, and he's not getting the benefit of it, and we've delivered, and yet, you know, where's the love? Well, you know, delivery is what you're, you know, in big programs is what a lot of your good pro-government constituencies want. It's what a lot of your progressive activists want. But the undecided voters, the working class voters, aren't looking for that. And in fact, they could be scared away. It could look like big taxes, big tax burdens, a lot of spending, and more inflation to them. So you just got to, you know, be a little circumspect when you talk about ambition, it seems to me. And so I endorse the current course here. Secondly is the culture wars. Look, I mean, if you break down these culture war issues, the vast majority of the country supports a moderate center ground position on them. So there's not a no-go zone, right? The problem is that we get caught in the crossfire between extremes on both sides, right? But the good news here, and I do want to be optimistic since I, you know, been maybe not as optimistic as I could be about things happening on our side, but the good point here is America looks like it's in a civil war sometimes. The red and blue states are at, it does look like a new civil war, but that's about 50% of the electorate. 25% of the voters identify as Democrats, 25% identify as Republicans, 49% now say they're independent. That's not pure, because when it comes voting time, they've only got two choices, and they gravitate to one party or the other. But that number's never been bigger. People they're defectors from the culture war. You know, they're AWOL from the culture war. They don't want to fight it. So what we're saying is the culture war is not forbidden ground. Go in there and offer a common sense center ground position, and you will win the debate with the voters we need to win. But you're also going to have to take your extremities with you as you do that.
Thank you. Harry, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I think we've got
just
limited time left. Yeah.
I'm not letting David leave without it.
Indeed. I think the big challenge that an incoming Labour government, if it wins in the next year or so, will face is this tension that Will is alluding to, which is, on the one hand, I think there's a huge amount of distrust. I don't think voters think that politics can solve a lot of these problems, and I think they're very nervous of them making it worse, and we saw that obviously with Liz Truss and the financial crisis around her budget. And so I think, you know, in that sense, the Labour Party, starting with reassurance, as Will has said, is right. At the same time, I think voters feel very, very financially, economically insecure. And I think they don't see certainly from the kind of current political debate, necessarily the answers in front of them. They think we need something, I think, bolder than what a lot of the public conversation is currently dominated by. And so I think Labour will have to kind of thread this needle, and Keir's talked about it a lot, the kind of stability and hope combination, to try and get it right. And I think that's going to be really, really difficult. But I think that is the route through. It's kind of both making sure that we're, you know, that the Labour Party can reassure voters that they are not going to make things worse, that financially they're very credible, but at the same time leaving enough space to do some of the bigger things that are needed. You talked about social care, you talked about tax reforms. There will be enough space to do some of that stuff.
David, do you want to wrap up?
Well, look, on the reassurance point, we're getting nowhere if we do not reassure the British electorate that we can run the economy. And because I've been around a while, I am not going to be making any commitments on social care or indeed on reforming inheritance tax. I'll leave it there.
Right. So thank you to all the speakers and everyone for attending. And I thank the Progressive Policy Institute for supporting this event. And if anyone would like to hear more about IPPRs, then please do sign up to their mailing list, which you can get onto using the QR code on your way out. So thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you.